Path. Written by Robert A. Webster. Narrated by Robert A. Webster. Prologue. Total devastation surrounded the solitary figure. Bombed out buildings and semi-submerged wrecks of a decimated fleet was all that now remained. He stood at the side of the concrete jetty, lost in thought, with his hands clasped behind his back. His weary features and grey hair made him appear far older than his 56 years. Dressed in a white seaman's pullover, slacks and highly polished boots, he appeared of average height and build, with average features, but he was by no means an average human being. He inhaled the warm spring air. His lungs filled the salty sea air mixed with stale diesel fuel. He occasionally looked up, ranting to himself. Apart from the few black-clad military figures and 2 civilians, the jetty and port were now deserted. Several hours earlier the dockside had been swarming with military personnel. Throughout the night they had been unloading boxes and huge crates from an army truck, sweating and swearing as they struggled to load them onto a sleek black submarine. Now the job was done, murmurings of relief could be heard from the soldiers, as, sapped from their strength, they struggled to climb aboard the high tailboards of a truck before being driven away. Suddenly the dockside was hushed, deserted except for a few U-boat crew and a handful of black-uniformed SS officers milling around. The senior officer received a call through his portable field telephone. Activity quickly returned as SS soldiers with machine guns rounded up the submarine's crew and ushered them aboard the vessel. The senior SS officer and 2 junior officers remained on the dockside. The submarine's hatches closed, and the 3 SS went to the foot of the gangway. A black Mercedes 770K with darker windows pulled up beside them. They stood smartly to attention and, taking short, sharp looks at each other, the junior officers eagerly opened the vehicle doors. A man and woman stepped out. The man ignored the waiting guards and headed along the jetty. The woman remained and spoke to the senior SS officer. "Let's leave him for a few minutes, Hans. This could be the last time you'd see his beloved country." Hans, the senior SS officer, clicked his heels together and nodded to confirm the woman's request as they watched him ranting to himself as he strode up the jetty. The Mercedes made a sharp U-turn. Hans clambered into the rear seat before it slowly pulled away. The Mercedes stopped approximately 50 yards away from the submarine and a dull crack echoed from within the vehicle. Hans got out of the car, holstered his smoking pistol and returned to the waiting group. The junior SS officers escorted the woman to join the man on the jetty. The man had remained undisturbed until the sound of several strident steps approaching broke his chain of thought. The woman stopped behind him and placed a comforting hand on his shoulders. He smelt her familiar and reassuring fragrance. "They're ready to leave," she whispered. He turned and smiled at the woman. The 2 soldiers who accompanied her snapped to attention, raised an arm in salute and stared ahead to avoid eye contact with the man. He gazed once more at the hills and countrysides surrounding the crater-filled and demolished buildings of the once great dockyard, with several rusted, twisted metallic hulks strewn around, the corpses of a once proud fleet. Tears welled up in his eyes as he inhaled deeply, with the knowledge that he would never return. He composed himself and strode purposely with the young woman by his side. They walked past the escorts, who fell in behind them and marched towards the large black U-boat, moored at the centre of the partly destroyed jetty. The vessel gently rolled from side to side, moved by rippling waves of the gentle spring tide. The group walked up to the foot of the submarine's gangplank. The party stopped and a man addressed the senior officer. "Everything set, Hans?" the man inquired. Hans snapped smartly to attention and confirmed that everything was going according to plan. He informed them that the submarine's crew were being detained in a forward compartment, but once they had boarded and settled into their quarters, he would release the crew and they would set sail. The man glanced at his car parked several yards away. He seemed to ignore this insignificance and addressed Hans again. "Well done, SS Oberfuhrer. What about the other matter?" The officer removed a photograph from his pocket and gave it to him. He stared at it for a few moments and then handed it to the woman, who looked, smiled and placed the picture in a handbag. "Very well, Hans. Let's get under way." He walked up the walkway, with the young blonde woman at his side. Without turning back they went inside the side hatch of the conning tower. SS Oberfuhrer Hans Kruger was a tall, well-built man, a domineering presence who commanded both respect and fear. Although primarily a commando, his real forte was far more sinister. He took his orders from 2 men, the first from his boss, SS Grubenführer Heinrich Müller, and the other had just entered the submarine. Hans remained on the dockside and marched over to the 2 escort soldiers. The 2 young soldiers stood erect and motionless. Hans removed his pistol from his holster, placed the barrel against one of the young officer's forehead, and fired a shot between his eyes, killing him instantly. The other soldier remained still, his eyes squinting slightly under the rim of his black peaked cap before his end came. Hans carried the lifeless bodies over to the parked car, dumping them in the back seat. He removed a container of nitropalmer from the car's boot. He doused a flammable mix over the corpses and car, which he ignited. The flames spread as Hans calmly walked up the gangway onto the vessel. The U-boat became a hive of activity as seamen came out of the hatchways and casted off the mooring lines. The captain and several crew members went to the conning bridge. The captain gave orders to the deck crew to make ready to shove off. It was a well-orchestrated routine, carried out and performed many times by this experienced and battle-hardened crew. The deckhands, once completing their tasks, headed back inside the vessel. Both the deck and the conning tower crew looked at the burning Mercedes, but because of the atrocities they had witnessed over the past few years, merely chose to ignore it as they readied the U-boat to set sail. The submarine's bow slewed away from the jetty and headed towards the mouth of the small port of Farge. The U-boat moved away from the dockside and, like a sleek whale, gently eased its way into open water. Apart from the captain, the conning tower crew went below decks. Captain Carl Victor watched as the U-boat picked up speed and its country faded into the distance behind him. There was a large explosion that echoed from the jetty as the nitro mix reached a critical temperature and blew the Mercedes and its occupants to smithereens. The captain stroked the black rubber stealth coating of the conning tower and listened to the battery banks whirring as they reached 17 knots. This is truly a magnificent machine, he thought. With this U-boat we could have won the war. He removed his cap to get some air to his head and looked at the instruments and gauges. 7th Adam, sir, shouted the dive officer from the intercom. Very well, prepare to dive the boat and level out at 4 meters, ordered the captain. Yes, sir, the dive officer confirmed, and he ordered the crew to open the main vents, rig out bow planes and set down 10 degrees. A sudden bustle of motion confirmed the crew's compliance, and the captain gave the order. Dives the boat. Sirens wailed to alert the occupants that the boat was about to submerge. The captain exited the conning tower, closed the hatch behind him, and went down into the control room. His thoughts were on the cargo, which he knew was looted treasure. The captain also realized that they were transporting special human cargo, but because he, along with his crew, had been locked up in the forward torpedo compartment and closely guarded by black uniform-clad SS soldiers, he hadn't been able to discover the identity of the passenger. Hans came into the control room and handed the captain a sealed envelope. Here are your orders, he snapped at the captain, who tore open the envelope and read its contents. The war-weary Haggard commander then gave orders to the control room crew. Helmsman, starboard 15, steer 350, down planes 10 degrees, make our depth 15 meters. The helmsman repeated the order aloud and pushed forward on the helm control. The captain picked up the boat's intercom and ordered all officers to join him in the wardroom. He went to his chart table and took out the charts to their destination. Captain Victor and Hans Kruger left the control bridge. The vessel angled down, and the electric boot gracefully glided under the cold grey North Sea. Chapter 1. Church, you okay? Ryan shouted, shaking his friend's shoulders. Church gazed around the room in a daze. He wiped some vomit from around his face and, as his faculties returned, composed himself and started to put his cluttered desktop in order. Ryan stood back watching while Church went through this unusual behaviour. After a short while, Church appeared to be his normal self. That must have been a powerful one, boss. Pinky and I felt it upstairs, so it must be a good case, said Ryan. Church coughed and replied, that was the worst experience and the most powerful spirit I had ever encountered. So yes, it could be a big case, probably our biggest yet. Who was it? Inquired Ryan. The answer never came. The door swung open and a pretty woman in her early 20s with short blonde hair entered the room with 2 mugs and went over to Church and Ryan. You okay, Church? Pinky asked. We also felt something, didn't we, Ryan? She handed the men each a mug of tea. Here, drink this. Thanks, but I need something stronger than tea, Pinky, said Church. I know, so I put a drop of Johnny Walker in it, Pinky replied. Great, said Ryan, as he slurped his tea and grimaced. Not for you, dopey, said Pinky and chuckled. Church took a drink of his beverage. He felt the whiskey hit the back of his throat, easing down, caressing his esophagus, giving him a warm glow. Church picked up his notepad, glanced at it, and then replaced it on the desk. Ryan picked up the pad. Pinky gazed at something that caught her attention in the corner of the room. She let out a gasp. All right, team, said Church. This is our next assignment. The Path Office, a detached traditional straw thatch roof cottage, was built during the late 16th century. It was located within a large clearing in a dense woodland area of Clifton Moor, close to the city of York. The cottage belonged to Churchill Potts, who inherited it from his grandparents, Pearl and Jack. Jack was a grumpy old git who possessed the gift. He was the guide and Pearl was the keeper. Churchill's father never acquired the gift. When he was 17 years old he joined the army, and after a few years he met and married June. They both distanced themselves from Pearl and Jack, as their weird ways scared June. They moved into a modern 1960s detached house in York City. Churchill Potts Jr. was born in 1970. Pearl and Jack hadn't had any contact with Churchill Sr. or June for many years. Then, uninvited, they turned up at the hospital while June was in labour. Pearl told her son that her grandson, Churchill Jr., possessed a gift, and it was strong. Churchill Sr. didn't want to know and was uninterested. Several years later, Jack passed away. Churchill's father, not wanting to lose his inheritance, reunited Pearl with his estranged family. Young Church became very close to his grandmother. Pearl died when Church was 10 years old, but she bequeathed the cottage to him for his 18th birthday. Pearl left strict instructions that the cottage remain sealed until then, and when Churchill Jr. moved into the cottage, only then would his parents be entitled to their inheritance. Churchill took up residence on his 18th birthday. He modernised a 4-bedroom cottage when he set up Path several years ago. It now incorporated modern furnishings, high-tech desktop and laptop computers, communications and surveillance systems, along with rooms and offices. The remote cottage suited Church because during the early years his gift made him reclusive. By the time he'd become familiar with his special talents, he'd grown accustomed to the solitude, although he was never fully alone. Chapter 2. A wealthy Englishman named Robert Potts had the cottage constructed at a specific secluded location. This was ideal for Robert and perfect for the inhabitants of the surrounding towns and villages, as they felt he was a warlock. During the mid-part of the 1600s, England was in turmoil. The Civil War just ended, and Charles I had been beheaded. This left a Cromwell-controlled protectorate government with deep Puritan beliefs. With the country ravaged, the English people was terrified and confused. This fear opened the way for a government-backed religious crusade to rid the country of those considered heretics. So witches and warlocks became an indoctrinated fear. This fear led to the formation of the witch-finders. These individuals scoured the country on high government salaries to flush out dark forces that allegedly manifested into human form. Robert was from a wealthy and respectable family. He'd fought during the English Civil War as an infantry officer in Oliver Cromwell's Roundheads. His father was a minister at York Abbey. After witnessing many bloody battles, Robert knew he wanted to follow his father's example and serve God within the clergy. He returned to York after the end of the Civil War at the age of 17. His father used his influence to push his son through the ranks to the junior ministerial position within York Abbey. Robert had suffered with slight headaches throughout his childhood, but it was on his 18th birthday when his headache started getting severe. He started to hear strange voices, and everybody now appeared bathed in a glowing white aura. Robert seemed to alter overnight, becoming reclusive. He no longer attended the clergy or fulfilled his duties, spending his time in his room. Robert went out most evenings. He strolled along the smoggy cobbled streets of York, amongst the hustle and bustle of the street vendors, which was a far cry from his sheltered religious upbringing, although he always felt a strange calling to these streets. It was on one of these nightly excursions where he met Elizabeth. Robert fell for her immediately, although thought she was a little strange. Robert met Elizabeth at a small street vendor's stall, where she cooked tripe and onions. She already knew his name, which shocked him, as he had never laid eyes on this pretty girl before. Robert noticed that the glow that surrounded her was crimson, so he realized that she was different. He returned to her stall every night. Elizabeth instigated the courtship and asked him to take her out, which in those days was unheard of, and she could have ended up in prison or far worse. Robert was intrigued and besotted with Elizabeth, and they soon became inseparable. She was 16 years old. "We're special," she'd always tell Robert. "We're chosen ones. You are the keeper, and I am your guide." This always confused Robert, but he accepted her strange behaviour because he was in love. Robert wanted to marry Elizabeth, but his parents never approved of this union. Elizabeth's bizarre behaviour made her parents disown her, so Robert's parents refused to grant the marriage until he announced that she was pregnant. His parents, although outraged, went ahead with the marriage, as having a child out of wedlock was inconceivable and would have destroyed the family's reputation. Moreover, they didn't want Robert's uncle finding out, as this man terrified people. His uncle was Matthew Hopkins, known throughout England as the Witchfinder General. Elizabeth died in childbirth when she was 17 years old. However, their infant son survived. Her death devastated Robert. He spent days and sometimes weeks in bed, ignoring everyone. He never acknowledged his son, refusing to give the child a name. As far as he was concerned, the infant had killed his beloved Elizabeth, so he did not exist. Several years went by. Robert's parents named their grandson William, raising the tot as their own. Late one night, Robert lay in bed, watching a candle flicker. He stared as the flames went through their nightly dance. He rubbed his temples hard. Damn these headaches. He closed his eyes and rubbed harder as the pain intensified. Suddenly, a large blue column of light appeared by the side of the candle. Robert sat up in bed and stared at the light, which appeared to be getting brighter. Then a familiar voice said, "Robert, my darling, I haven't got long to explain. You are a chosen one, and it is your time. You must take our son and find our portal, so we can all be together." Taken aback, Robert felt confused. He assumed that he must have fallen asleep and he was dreaming, although the experience seemed very real. That was the start of his transition. After his initial contact with Elizabeth, he started to integrate back in society and spent time with his son. His uncle, concerned about his strange behaviour, which he would not accept or tolerate, decided that Robert should find somewhere to hide for his own safety. Robert agreed. Although he did not fully understand, Robert knew that he needed to find the portal that Elizabeth told him about, hoping and praying that if he found this object he would see her again. He scoured the Yorkshire countryside on horseback for several months. One warm clear night he came across a large circular clearing within the dense forest area of Clifton Moor. The large patch of earth seemed out of place amongst the woodland. Robert led his horse out of the woods and went over to the circular spot of land. He noticed rocks assembled in neat rows around the circle, with a large scorched area at its centre. Robert trembled with fear. "A witch's coven," he thought. "Damn! I heard there were witches in this area. Why have I been led here? Uncle's right, I am possessed." He turned around, grabbed the horse's reins, and, as he placed his foot in the stirrup, a sharp pain shot through his head. "Not now," he thought as the pain intensified. "Robert! Robert!" said a familiar voice behind him. He removed his foot from the stirrup and swung around. In the centre of the circle was a vivid blue column of light, with a crimson figure glowing at its centre. Although he couldn't make out any distinctive features, he recognised the voice. He dropped to his knees and stared into the light. "Elizabeth! Elizabeth!" he wailed. Over the next few months, Robert worked tirelessly. With his parents' money and a few overpaid builders from the nearby town, he built a thatched-roof cottage on the patch of land that contained the portal. Robert designed the cottage so the portal would appear in the corner of the room on the ground floor, which he used for a bedroom. He took his son and they lived in the cottage, just the three of them. The pots reared livestock and grew fruits and vegetables, which kept them isolated from the outside world. Elizabeth's spirits taught Robert about the world she now inhabited. She explained about the gift and advised him how to use the power wisely. She imparted instructions on how he would make his living, and Robert noted down everything. For their son William grew up believing that their way of life was perfectly normal. His father spoke to an area in the bedroom, but even though he saw nothing, he believed his father when he told him that he was speaking with his dead mother. Robert schooled him and they worked and lived off their surroundings. Robert went into Ratcliffe town several times a month for supplies. The townsfolk were always wary and suspicious of the Potts. However, they knew who Robert's uncle was, so they didn't want to risk themselves being accused of sorcery and burned at the stake. They ignored the Potts whenever possible. It was on his 18th birthday when William first encountered his mother. He was reading the manuscript by candlelight on a cold winter's evening when suddenly he felt a sharp pain in his head. He rushed to his father's bedroom as the pain became more intense. William stood in awe at the sight in front of him. A large plume of blue light filled the corner of the room, with a shimmering crimson figure at its centre. He couldn't make out any clear features, however he felt euphoric, and the pain in his head had vanished, leaving just a warm narcotic feeling. His father stood to the side of the blue column and smiled at him. "William, meet your mother," exclaimed Robert. Over the next few years they lived as a complete, although strange family. Elizabeth instructed William to find a wife. She told him who and where this particular person was, informing her son that this woman was his chosen one and possessed the gift. William found the girl. She was 16 and in jail in the village of Woodford, awaiting trial for witchcraft. He instantly fell in love with her. William and Robert used their elderly uncle's influence as the witchfinder general and got the girl Rebecca released. She moved into the cottage, where she and William married. Shortly after they had a daughter, who in time was also instructed on whom to marry. Robert died at 65 years old. He and Elizabeth's spirits continued to teach William, who then died and taught his children and grandchildren, which continued with the Potts bloodline throughout the ages. The centuries passed. More development took place around the area of the Potts' thatched-roof cottage. The roads were upgraded so the children could be driven into town for schooling. The Potts family always seemed to have money. Whether inherited or obtained, nobody from outside knew. Chapter 3. The path team gathered around Church's mahogany desk, with items strewn around, resembling the aftermath of a drunken Saturday night brawl. Pinky got a wet cloth and wiped Church's face, while Ryan again tried to decipher Church's notes. A laptop was overturned. Church pulled it closer to him, checked it was okay, turned it on and entered a password. "It scorched the wall," said Pinky, pointing to the corner wall of the office. "And looking at you, boss, it did more than that. We knew it was serious as it seemed to have sucked the air out of the building," she added. "So was it?" again inquired Ryan. "Is there lots of lovely treasure to be had? And why are your spirit notes in German? I can't understand them." Anybody we know? Inquired Pinky. Granny Pearl never came, did she? I can't smell the Brussels sprouts, said Ryan. Church took another slurp of his drink and sat back in his chair. He pondered the barrage of questions and calmly said, To answer your question, Ryan, then yes, I imagine there's a great deal of treasure. And no, Granny Pearl never appeared, and that's what scares me. Church then leant forward and started to type on the laptop. And the answers to your other questions? This individual was a German. And do we know him? Most definitely. Church paused as a face appeared on his laptop screen. He turned the computer screen around so that Ryan and Pinky could view the image and continued. We all know of him. The entire world knew this character, and according to Grandpa Jack, he was a bloody menace. Church smiled, and then his expression changed as he announced, I can sense you're both anxious. I feel some trepidation after my encounter with this powerful spirit, but in the immortal words of my namesake and Jack's hero, this could be our finest hour. Churchill Potts had just turned 40, with a small stocky build, thin in hair and jovial features. He could easily have been mistaken for Bob Hoskins. He had led a sheltered and secluded life up until his mid-30s, due to the strange and powerful gift which he possessed. He was named Churchill, the same as his father. His grandfather Jack had named his son after his hero Winston Churchill, so he therefore bestowed the odd name onto his son. Churchill's childhood was far from normal. His parents, Junior Churchill Sr., were caring parents, but young Church spent most of his weekends with his grandmother Pearl at her cottage in the middle of Clifton Moor. Granny Pearl was a cheerful old woman who lived alone after her husband Jack passed away several years earlier, although as she told him she spoke to Jack every night, and Church would meet his granddad one day. He enjoyed spending weekends and holidays at the cottage, and although it always smelled of Brussels sprouts, it felt comfortable. The countryside surrounding the cottage was picturesque and alive with wildlife going about their daily amblings. It was a great adventure for a curious, solitary little boy. Church attended primary school in York, but found it difficult to make friends. Church could not understand why he was different. His blinding headaches and voices gave his teachers cause for concern. Church considered the special gift that Granny Pearl had told him he possessed was a pain in the arse. When Granny Pearl died, young Church was given an ancient key, hung on a silver chain, and informed to keep it safe. The lawyer from Mason & Mason was an old family lawyer, so Church Sr. and Junior knew that they could do nothing until Church became 18. It was the eve of his 18th birthday when Church's life changed. He woke with a sharp pain in his temples. Although he suffered with headaches most of his life, this was the worst pain he had ever felt. He sat up in bed and squeezed his hand against his head. Through his pain he noticed a blue column of vivid light. His pain started to subside, and he stared at the plume as it increased in size. Something else illuminated his senses. It was a familiar smell of Brussels sprouts. He watched in awe as a myriad of colours started to take shape. An unfocused multicoloured human formed within the centre of the plume, and then a familiar voice that he had not heard for 8 years said, Hello, Churchill, you have grown. I don't have long to talk. I know you're confused, but when you move into the cottage all will become clear. I have a lot to teach you. The figure then faded, along with the blue light, leaving Church bewildered but feeling euphoric. The next morning, Church, along with his parents, drove to the cottage. Church always had fond memories of the small thatch-roof cottage from his childhood, so relished the chance to live there. With the cottage being sealed and furnishings all covered, it had remained in good condition, only requiring a clean. The electrical switches and appliances, although archaic, were in working order. The water supplies from an old well outside, which Jack had plumbed into a system of pipes, feeding directly into the house. Church Senior had called Mason & Mason to confirm his son was moving in, so wanted his inheritance. The lawyer informed him that he was somewhere in the house, and young Church would know the location. Church was clueless, and told them he didn't know anything, so they decided to search the property. For some strange reason, Church felt drawn to a room on the ground floor. On entering the room, he saw a large pentagram surrounded by a circle painted on the floor in one corner, with a large vivid blue column of light emitting from its centre, and two iridescent figures in the centre of the light. One was crimson and the other a multicoloured rainbow. The apparition shimmered, and the familiar aroma of Brussels sprouts wafted around the room. Happy birthday, young Churchill, said a man's voice, followed by a familiar woman's voice. Churchill, meet your granddad, Jack. Church smiled and said, Granny Pearl, fancy meeting you here. Both spirits chuckled, and Granny Pearl said, Happy birthday, Church. We can talk more later. But for now, let's make your parents happy so they can leave, and we can begin your tutoring. You will be relieved to hear that you will no longer be plagued by headaches. Your dad's always been a greedy, money-grabbing little sod, interrupted Jack. Pearl curtly replied, Be quiet, Jack. We have to help Church. You must have been secretly dating that bloody milkman. Certainly no son of mine, grumbled Jack. Shush, stupid, snapped Pearl. as Church looked on at this exchange between the two spirits and chuckled. He knew his life would now change for the better. Pearl gave Church directions to an area outside the cottage and told him that he would find a chest buried there, which contained various valuable items. She instructed him what to give his parents and what he must keep. Church and his parents found the spot under a large gnarled oak tree. It was marked by a cross and a rose symbol scorched into the ground. Church took up the small ancient chest. He took the ancient key and chain that he had worn since he was 10 years old from around his neck and opened the lock. The old lid creaked open and they all curiously peered inside. The small chest contained various items of gold and silver jewellery adorned with rough-cut precious stones, along with several gold coins and ingots dating back to the late 16th century. There was also a leather-bound journal, the pages of which appeared aged and ragged. They took the chest into the cottage and laid it on the kitchen table. Church Senior produced a duffel bag and proceeded to load the loot into that. Church removed the book and glanced within the pages. He noticed they were made from various materials, from old parchment to typing paper, and appeared to have been compiled over the centuries by different authors. He noticed the later entries were made by his grandmother, who he knew had an old typewriter. Once the box was empty, Church locked it and replaced the key around his neck as Pearl had instructed. He placed the chest into an old cupboard in the scullery. His parents stayed with him most of the morning. They brought food and basic provisions with them, and after his mother had cooked them lunch, they announced they wanted to leave. Church knew they were impatient to leave and go to value and sell their inheritance. His parents drove away, both happy with their newfound wealth. Once his parents had gone, Church went to the spirit room to learn about the family business. Ryan and Pinky stood at the screen in disbelief. Church studied his notes and scribbled on other pads certain portions of the text. Ryan broke the awkward silence. "I don't understand, boss. Why now?" He pointed to the screen and continued. "He's been dead for over 60 years, and according to the history books he was childless." Church looked up from his notes, leaned forward and stated, "History is wrong." He referred to his notes and said, "But it's not only the fact of whom this individual is that scares me." He tapped on the screen and continued, "It's the recipient of the treasure who alarms me." He took a clean sheet of notepad and scribbled down a name and showed it to the inquisitive Pinky and Ryan, who both let out a gasp. There was a stunned silence for several moments, as Pinky and Ryan stared at both the screen and the name on the notepad. Pinky broke the silence. "What's the connection, and how's this possible?" "I'm not sure yet. This will take our combined power and a lot of research to solve this case," said Church, and nervously continued. "Let me fully decipher my notes and we can make a start on this investigation." "I'm not happy with this one, boss. Do we have to take the case?" Ryan asked. "Maybe a cheese and ham sandwich would help," smiled Pinky, trying to lighten the mood, but she knew that Ryan would do anything if the reward involved food. "Oh, well, why didn't you say that before?" chuckled Ryan. "Where do we start?" he asked. Church looked at his team. This assignment was clearly dangerous, and he didn't want to put them in jeopardy. He considered them his family. After pondering the situation, he decided they should not risk taking this case. He thought that they had too much to lose. "Okay, I've decided. This must have been a maverick spirit that came through unescorted. We'll just ignore this one." "Phew," said a relieved Pinky. "But can we do that?" Ryan asked, also pleased by Church's decision, but he had a niggling doubt, so continued. "After all, it's a spirit in need, and possibly loads of treasure." Church's reply never came, as the portal filled with a bright blue column of light that only Church could see, although Ryan and Pinky sensed the room's aroma change. "Brussels sprouts," noticed Ryan, sniffing the air. "Granny Pearl's here," announced Pinky. "Sorry about this. I hope you enjoyed this little snippet. Don't despair. If you want to listen to the book in its entirety, you can either buy it at cdbaby.com, or if you don't want to pay for it, just go to my website at www.buddhasauthor.com, go to my contact page, send me your email address, and I'll send you the whole version in the Dropbox, because that's the kind and generous person that I am, and I'm even prepared to forfeit a pair of dapper new flip-flops for your total enjoyment. Thank you all very much for listening.